Wooden crosses were floating across the harbour. Jean Parisot de la Valette stood on the walls of Fort St. Angelo and watched them come. 6 of them. 7. More appearing from the direction of the fort that had fallen the night before. He did not need to look closely to understand what he was seeing. His men, the knights who had held Fort St. Elmo for 31 days against an army of 40,000. The men he had sent across that harbour every night for a month, knowing most of them would not come back. They had held until the last man fell, until the walls were rubble, and the ammunition was gone, and 2 Spanish captains, too wounded to stand, had themselves strapped into chairs and carried to the breach so they could die facing the enemy. The Ottomans had decapitated their bodies, fixed them to crosses in mockery of the faith the knights had died defending, and floated them across the harbour toward the man who had sent them there. La Valette was 71 years old. He had spent decades preparing for this specific moment. The fleet on the horizon, the walls of Malta, the defense that Europe needed someone to make. He stood on the ramparts and looked at the crosses for a long time. Then he turned to his officers. He did not order prayers. He did not order a moment of silence. He did not speak about God or faith or the souls of the men floating in the harbour. He ordered the cannon crews to the walls. He had Ottoman prisoners in the fortress, men taken in the fighting over the past weeks. He gave a specific order about what was to be done with them. Their heads were removed, loaded into the cannons, fired across the harbour into the Ottoman camp. The message was not subtle. The message was, "We see what you have become, and we have decided to become it too." The siege of Malta was 6 weeks old. It had nearly 3 months still to run, and the man standing on those walls, the man who had just ordered human heads, fired from cannons at dawn, was the defender of Christian civilization in the Mediterranean. Both of those things were true simultaneously. La Valette was not the first Grand Master to fire human heads from cannons. He was not the first knight to give that order, or the last. It was the kind of war this had always been. A war where both sides had long since decided that the normal rules did not apply to the other. The Knights of St. John were an anachronism by 1565. They had been founded in Jerusalem in the 11th century as hospitallers, monks who ran a hospital for Christian pilgrims, caring for the sick and the poor. Over time, they became warriors too, fighting crusades, defending the Holy Land. For 2 centuries, they were at the center of every major Christian military operation in the Mediterranean. Then, the crusades ended. The Holy Land was lost. The world moved on. The knights did not. They held roads for 200 years after everyone else had come home. Suleiman, the Magnificent himself, had to lay siege to the island in 1522 with 100,000 men before they finally surrendered. And even then, he let them leave with their weapons and their lives, an act of respect from one professional to another. They sailed away with nothing except their ships and their reputation. They needed somewhere to go. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V gave them Malta, not as a gift, as a disposal. Malta was a barren limestone rock 50 miles south of Sicily. Almost no trees, almost no fresh water, soil too thin to farm properly. A population of farmers and fishermen who had no particular interest in hosting a military order of crusading knights. Charles gave it to them for the annual fee of 1 Maltese falcon, a transaction so absurd it became a running joke in European courts. The knights took it anyway, because they had no choice, and because they understood something about Malta that Charles apparently did not. It sat at the exact center of the Mediterranean. Every ship moving between the Christian West and the Ottoman East had to pass within range of it. Whoever held Malta held a knife at the throat of Mediterranean trade. The knights put that knife to immediate use. Within years of arriving, they had built one of the most effective raiding operations in the Mediterranean. Their galleys hunted Ottoman and Muslim shipping with the same ferocity they had once brought to crusading. They took cargo, they took prisoners, they enslaved crews. La Valette's own ships took approximately 3,000 Muslim and Jewish slaves during his tenure as Grand Master. Men and women chained to oars, worked until they broke, sold when they were no longer useful. This is the part the European celebrations of Malta's defense consistently omit. The knights were not simply defenders of the faith, they were the most prolific slavers in the Western Mediterranean. The same order that ran hospitals for the poor ran one of the largest slave operations of the 16th century. Nobody celebrating the victory talked about that part. La Valette understood this better than anyone because he had been on the other side of it. In 1541, his galley was captured by Barbary corsairs working for the Ottoman Empire. He spent a year chained to an oar, not as a commander, not as a grand master, as property. Worked in the same conditions he imposed on the men his own ships captured. He survived because he was strong enough to survive. He was ransomed eventually. The knights traded prisoners regularly, a practical arrangement that both sides maintained even while killing each other. And he returned to Malta. He never spoke publicly about that year. What it did to him was visible in everything he did afterward. He became obsessive about preparation, about intelligence, about never being caught without a plan. He built a network of spies in Constantinople that fed him information about Ottoman intentions months before any attack materialized. He spent years reinforcing Malta's fortifications. He studied every detail of Ottoman siege tactics, the same tactics that had taken Rhodes, taken Constantinople, taken Belgrade. He knew what was coming. The only question was when. The answer arrived in the form of a knight named Romegas. Romegas was the order's most effective and most reckless sea captain. In 1564, he captured several large Ottoman merchant ships in a single raid, a significant haul of cargo and prisoners. Among the prisoners was the governor of Cairo, the governor of Alexandria, and the former nurse of Suleiman's own daughter. Suleiman had been tolerating the knights for decades. He had let them leave Rhodes with their lives. He had watched them settle on Malta and rebuild. He had allowed the situation to continue because there were always larger concerns, campaigns in Persia, in Hungary, the endless demands of running an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Romegas's raid ended his patience permanently. By the end of 1564, Suleiman had made his decision. The knights would be erased. Malta would be taken. The Western Mediterranean would be opened for Ottoman expansion into Sicily, into Italy, into the heart of Christian Europe. He assembled the largest fleet the Ottoman Empire had sent west in a generation. 180 ships, 40,000 soldiers, the elite Janissaries, the same force that had taken Constantinople, Rhodes, Belgrade. 2 experienced commanders, Mustafa Pasha leading the land forces, Piyale Pasha commanding the fleet, and a third figure who terrified the knights more than either of them, Dragut. His real name was Turgut Reis. He was the most capable naval commander in the Mediterranean, the man who had taken over the Ottoman Corsair Empire after Barbarossa's death and expanded it further than anyone thought possible. He had raided the coasts of Spain. He had humiliated the Genoese admiral Andrea Doria. He knew Malta intimately. He had raided it 7 times between 1540 and 1565. He knew every harbour, every approach, every weakness in the fortifications. He also knew La Valette personally. Both men had been galley slaves. Dragut had been captured by the Genoese, chained to an oar for 4 years before Barbarossa ransomed him. La Valette had been captured by Dragut's own predecessors. They had spent their careers trying to destroy each other across the same stretch of Mediterranean water. They were the same age. They had survived the same thing. And now, Dragut was sailing toward Malta with 40,000 men, while La Valette was waiting for him on the walls. La Valette's spies sent word from Constantinople in early 1565. The fleet was coming. It would arrive in May. He had months to prepare and no illusions about what preparation meant. Malta had approximately 6,000 defenders against 40,000 attackers. There would be no matching the Ottomans in open battle. There would be no cavalry, charge, no relief army riding to the rescue. There was only the stone of the fortifications and the willingness of the men inside them to die slowly enough to matter. He made his preparations, reinforced the walls, stockpiled food and ammunition, drilled the Maltese volunteers alongside the knights, sent urgent requests to the European powers for reinforcements, requests that were received, acknowledged, and largely ignored by courts more concerned with their own borders than with a rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. Then he waited. On the morning of May 18th, 1565, a lookout on the walls of Fort St. Angelo saw something on the southern horizon, a darkness, moving, too wide to be a storm, too organized to be anything except what it was. 180 ships, the largest Ottoman fleet the Mediterranean had seen in years, moving steadily toward the harbor where La Valette was standing. Everything he had prepared for, everything he had known was coming since the day he First put on the Grand Master's robes, it was here. 4 months would determine whether Europe survived or fell. Stick around until the end, and subscribe if this is your kind of history. 40,000 men, and before a single cannon was fired, the commanders were already fighting each other. Mustafa Pasha, commanding the land forces, wanted to bypass the harbour forts entirely, march straight to Medina, the island's capital in the centre, cut off the knights from the Maltese population, starve them out. Standard siege doctrine for an island campaign. Piale Pasha, commanding the fleet, refused. His ships needed a sheltered harbour. The harbour entrance was controlled by Fort St. Elmo. Take St. Elmo first, Piale argued, and the fleet has a safe anchorage for the entire campaign. Without it, they were exposed to Mediterranean storms that could destroy everything. Dragut wasn't there yet. He was sailing from Tripoli and would arrive later. So the two commanders argued without their best strategic mind present, and Piale won. It was the most consequential mistake of the entire siege, because La Valette had anticipated exactly this. He had gambled that the Ottomans would come for the harbour forts first. He had moved more than half his heavy artillery into Fort St. Elmo, specifically because of that gamble. When the Ottoman engineers arrived on Mount Sybaris, the high ground overlooking the fort, and looked down at their target, they made a calculation. 3 days, maybe 5. A fort that size, against this artillery, would be rubble in less than a week. They were wrong by 26 days. Fort St. Elmo was small, a 4-pointed star shape, built on the tip of a narrow peninsula, surrounded by water on 3 sides. It should not have been able to hold against what the Ottomans brought to bear on it. 60 cannons, including the Great Bombard, a weapon that fired a 150-pound stone ball from 3,000 yards. The bombardment began. On May 27th, the noise was audible on the Italian mainland. La Valette watched from Fort St. Angelo across the harbour and made calculations of his own. Every day St. Elmo held was a day the Ottoman army was not attacking the main fortifications at Birgu and Senglea. Every day was food consumed from Ottoman supplies that had to be shipped from Constantinople. Every day was the Mediterranean summer burning through the campaigning season. La Valette did not need to win. He needed to last long enough for the season to turn and the relief force to arrive. He needed St. Elmo to die as slowly as possible. The garrison inside the fort understood this. They were not holding because they expected rescue. They were holding because La Valette had told them plainly what their purpose was. Buy time, cost the Ottomans everything you can, and hold until you cannot hold anymore. Every night La Valette sent small boats across the harbour under darkness with fresh men and supplies. Every morning, the bombardment resumed. Dragut arrived in late May. He took one look at the Ottoman positions and understood immediately what had gone wrong. The artillery was poorly positioned. The approach trenches were dug at the wrong angle. The assault tactics were wasting men. He began reorganizing everything. New gun placements, new approach routes, coordinated assaults that stripped the defenders of any moment to recover between attacks. The pace of destruction accelerated. The knights inside St. Elmo were running out of everything. Men, ammunition, wall. The bombardment had fired over 70,000 cannonballs at the fort by the time it fell, a number so large it is difficult to visualize. The walls were not damaged. They were gone. What remained was rubble, broken stone and dust, and the smell of spent powder that never fully cleared. The defenders improvised barriers from barrels filled with stone, from doors torn off their hinges, from mattresses, from timber dragged from collapsed buildings. When those ran out, they used the bodies of their own dead. A Spanish soldier named Francisco Balbi di Correggio kept a diary inside the fort during those final weeks. He was not a knight, he was an ordinary soldier, one of the Spanish regulars who had been sent to reinforce the garrison early in the siege. He wrote about what it was like to sleep in rubble, to eat one small meal a day, and fight for 12 hours on the strength of it, to watch the man beside you take a cannonball fragment in the chest and keep fighting for another hour before his legs gave out, to wake up each morning and count who was still standing and understand that the number was smaller than yesterday and would be smaller again tomorrow. He wrote about the noise most of all. The bombardment was continuous during the assault phases, not occasional shots, but sustained concentrated fire that made the ground shake and the air itself feel wrong. Men went partially deaf. They communicated by gesture and lip reading. Some stopped reacting to the sound entirely, which Balbi noted was more frightening than flinching. The moment a man stops registering danger is the moment something in him has gone somewhere else. The garrison was down to a few hundred men by early June, from over 1,000 at the start. On June 8th, they sent a message to La Valette across the harbour. The fort was no longer defensible in any conventional sense. They were requesting permission to attempt a breakout, fight their way to the main fortifications, while they still had men capable of the attempt. La Valette refused. He sent back an order so cold it stopped men in their tracks. The garrison would hold. If they felt the fort could not be defended by the men currently inside it, he would send fresh troops to replace them, and the current defenders could return to the main fortifications in the boats that brought the replacements. He was offering them a chance to leave, but the implication was clear. Their replacements would die in their place, and La Valette was prepared to let that happen. Most of the garrison chose to stay. Dragut was in a trench near the Ottoman artillery positions on June 17th, arguing with his gun crews about the angle of their fire. He believed they were shooting too high, wasting shot on the upper walls when lower concentrated fire would breach the foundations faster. He leaned forward to sight along one of the barrels himself. A cannon fired from Fort St. Angelo across the harbour. The ball struck the edge of the trench. Stone fragments exploded outward. One piece caught Dragut in the head. He did not die immediately. He was carried to his tent. He lingered for several days. Some accounts say he lived until the day St. Elmo finally fell, long enough to hear that the fort had been taken before his eyes closed. Other accounts say he died before that. Either way, he never recovered consciousness. The Ottomans lost their best commander to a fragment of stone on the 16th day of a siege their engineers had said would take 3. Fort St. Elmo held for 15 more days after Dragut fell. On June 23rd, the last defenders took their positions in the final breaches. 2 Spanish captains, Juan de Guaras and Juan de Miranda, had wounds so severe they could not stand. They had themselves strapped into chairs and carried to the gap in the wall so they could face the final assault sitting upright. They died there. Every night inside the fort died. 9 men survived by swimming across the harbour in the darkness before the end. The Ottomans had taken a fort their engineers said would fall in days. It had taken them 31 days. It had cost them over 6,000 men. It had killed their finest commander, and it had given La Valette exactly what he needed: time. Weeks of it. Weeks the Ottoman army spent bleeding against a small star-shaped fort while the main defences at Birgu and Senglia were reinforced, supplied, and prepared. When Mustafa Pasha walked through the ruins of St. Elmo and looked across the harbour at the larger fortifications still intact, still flying the knight's banner, still manned, still armed, he said something that became famous. If so small a son cost us so dear, what will the father cost? He already knew the answer was going to be catastrophic. He ordered the bodies of the fallen knights decapitated, fixed to wooden crosses, floated across the harbour. La Valette was on the walls when they arrived. You already know what he ordered next. The heads landed in the Ottoman camp before noon. Mustafa Pasha received the message clearly. La Valette had seen what they did to his men. He had responded in the only language both sides understood anymore. The war had no floor left. Mustafa reorganized his forces and turned them toward the main fortifications, Birgu and Sengleia, 2 peninsulas jutting into the Grand Harbour, connected by a narrow bridge, protected by Fort St. Angelo at the tip of Birgu and Fort St. Michael at the tip of Sengleia. This was where the remaining knights were. This was where La Valette was. This was where the siege would actually be decided. The Ottoman army that arrived at Birgu and Sengleia was not the same army that had landed in May. 6,000 men were gone. Dragut was dead. The commanders were arguing more openly now. Mustafa and Piale had disagreed about St. Elmo, and Piale had been wrong, and neither man had forgotten it. The Janissaries who had survived 31 days of assault on a small harbour fort were tired in a way that rest could not fix, but they still had 30,000 men, and the defenders had fewer than 4,000 left capable of fighting. La Valette had used the time St. Elmo bought him well. The walls of Birgu and Sengleia had been reinforced with earthworks packed behind the stone, so that even when Ottoman cannonballs blew through the outer face, the inner wall of compressed earth absorbed the impact. Traps had been set in the approaches. A heavy chain had been stretched across the channel between the 2 forts to stop Ottoman ships from entering. A wooden bridge connected Birgu and Senglea, so defenders could move quickly between them. He had also done something the Ottomans did not know about yet. He had hidden cannons inside the walls at water level, positioned at the exact height and angle to hit boats crossing the channel, concealed behind thin outer masonry that looked solid from a distance. The guns were loaded. The crews were waiting. All they needed was a target. On July 15th, Mustafa gave them one. He launched a simultaneous attack, land assault on the walls, while a flotilla of small boats carried 1,000 janissaries across the channel to hit Senglea from the water. It was a well-designed plan. 2 directions at once, force the defenders to split their attention, hit the weakest point while the strongest was occupied. The boats moved into the channel. La Valette's hidden cannons fired. 2 salvos. That was all it took. The boats were packed with men and moving slowly in confined water. The chain shot, 2 cannonballs connected by a length of chain designed to spin and shred everything in its path, tore through the flotilla at close range. Most of the boats went down immediately. Of the 1,000 janissaries who had entered the water, fewer than 200 reached the shore. The rest drowned in the channel, pulled under by their armor. The land assault failed at the same time. The earthwork walls absorbed the Ottoman charge. The defenders held. Mustafa had lost 1,000 of his best soldiers in an afternoon and gained nothing. The siege dragged into August. This is where it became a test of who could keep going when keeping going made no sense. The walls of Birgu were crumbling in multiple places. The defenders were patching breaches with whatever they could find. Timber, barrels, the rubble of their own fortifications. Food was rationed to 1 meal a day. Fresh water was running low. The heat of the Maltese summer was relentless. Men fighting in full armor in temperatures that made the metal burn to touch. The relief force from Europe had not come. La Valette had sent request after request to Sicily, to Spain, to Rome. Some troops had been promised. A small advance force of several hundred men had managed to slip through the Ottoman blockade in June. A brief flash of hope that faded quickly when it became clear that was all that was coming for now. The main relief force was still being assembled, still being argued over by men in courts who were not on these walls. La Valette did not tell his men this. He told them the relief was coming, that they had to hold a little longer. He had been saying it for weeks. Some of them still believed him. Some had stopped believing and were fighting anyway because there was nothing else to do. On August 7th, the Ottomans came the closest they would ever come to breaking through. A massive assault on Birgu, the largest single attack of the entire siege. Ottoman soldiers breached the outer wall in 2 places simultaneously and poured into the streets of the town. Not probing attacks, not feints, real penetration. Hundreds of Ottoman soldiers inside the defensive perimeter, fighting hand to hand in the narrow alleys between buildings that had already been half destroyed by weeks of bombardment. The noise was different from anything that had come before. Not the distant percussion of cannon fire, but something immediate and close. The sound of men killing each other in the streets of a town the size of a city block. Steel on stone, bodies hitting walls. The specific human sounds of close quarters, fighting that carry further than the participants ever realize. La Valette heard it from his command position. He was 71 years old. He had a leg wound from a grenade fragment that had not properly healed. It had been seeping for weeks, aggravated by the constant movement of command, never given the rest it needed. He had been awake for most of the previous 48 hours. He had not eaten properly in days. He picked up a pike. His officers placed themselves between him and the door. A Grand Master did not fight in the streets. If he died, the defense died with him. There was no one else with the authority or the presence to hold what remained of the garrison together. He was not a soldier anymore. He was the idea that kept the soldiers fighting. You did not risk an idea in a breach. La Valette looked at them, then he walked through them. He moved through the streets of Birgu toward the sound of the fighting, past wounded men being dragged to the rear, past the rubble of buildings that had been standing 3 months ago, past the defenders falling back from the breach, men who had been holding the line and were now giving ground step by step because there were simply too many Ottomans coming through. He reached the gap in the wall. He stepped into it. The defenders nearest him saw their Grand Master first, the old man they had been fighting for, the man who had sent them to die in Fort St. Elmo and refused their request to retreat, and burned the bridge and stood on the ramparts through every bombardment. standing in the breach with a pike like a common soldier, bleeding from the leg, not ordering them forward, just there, refusing to move. Something happened in those men that is difficult to describe precisely. They stopped retreating. It was not a tactical decision. It was not a calculation about odds or positioning, or the strength of the Ottoman force pouring through the breach. It was simpler than that. Their commander was standing in the most dangerous place on the island, and he was not leaving. And if he was not leaving, then neither were they. The counterattack that followed pushed the Ottomans back through the breach. The gap was sealed with rubble and timber and men standing shoulder to shoulder. The assault failed. La Valette returned to his command position. He was bleeding from a new wound he had not mentioned to anyone. His officers noticed it. None of them said anything. The days that followed were the darkest of the siege. The walls were held, but barely. The defenders were exhausted beyond the point where rest could help. Every morning they woke up and the Ottoman army was still there, still vast, still armed, still attacking. There seemed to be no end to it. Then, La Valette made a decision that nobody expected. He burned the bridge. The wooden bridge connecting Birgu and Senglea had been a lifeline. It allowed defenders to move quickly between the two forts, to reinforce whichever was under heaviest attack. Burning it meant cutting that connection permanently. It meant the two garrisons would fight separately, unable to support each other. His officers thought he had lost his mind. La Valette explained it once. If the bridge stood, men would think about retreating. Across it, they would think about falling back to the stronger fort. That option would be in their heads during the hardest moments. The moment when men decide whether to hold or run. Remove the option, remove the thought. They would hold where they stood because there was nowhere else to go. The bridge burned. The two garrisons looked at the gap where it had been. Then they turned back to the walls. By late August, the Ottoman camp was a different place from the one that had arrived in May. Disease had spread through the tents. Dysentery, fever, the inevitable result of thousands of men living in close quarters through a long, hot summer. Ammunition was running low. Food was being rationed. The soldiers who had come to Malta expecting a quick campaign were now 3 months in with no end in sight. Mustafa knew the campaigning season was ending. The Mediterranean weather would turn in September. Keeping an army of this size supplied on a small island through winter was not possible. He needed to break through before the season closed. He ordered one final massive assault for late August. Everything at once. Siege towers, infantry, artillery. The full weight of what remained of his force thrown at the walls in a single coordinated push. La Valette had hidden cannon in the walls again. When the siege towers rolled forward, he ordered the outer masonry chipped away from the concealed guns. The towers came within range. The cannon fired chain shot at the base of the towers. They collapsed. Hundreds of men died in the wreckage. The assault dissolved into chaos. A deep silence fell over the Ottoman camp after that assault failed. Not the silence of an army preparing for the next attack. The silence of an army that has started to understand something it did not want to understand. Then a rider came into La Valette's command post. A relief force had landed on the north of the island. 8,000 men. Spanish soldiers and Italian volunteers, finally sent by the courts that had been ignoring Malta's requests for months. It was September 7th. The siege had been running for 112 days. Mustafa had a choice. He still outnumbered the relief force. 8,000 fresh Spanish and Italian soldiers against what remained of his army, depleted, diseased, exhausted, but still larger. A commander with his confidence intact might have turned to meet the relief force, destroyed it before it could reach the fortifications, then returned to finish the siege. Mustafa was not that commander anymore. 3 months on this island had done something to him that 40,000 men and the full weight of the Ottoman military machine had not been able to do to La Valette. It had broken his certainty. The army that arrived in May believing Malta would fall in days was not the army standing in September. The men who had stormed the beaches with complete confidence in the outcome had watched St. Elmo take 31 days to fall, had watched Dragut die from a stone fragment, had watched 1,000 janissaries drown in a channel, had watched siege towers collapse from hidden cannons, had watched an old man with a pike stand in a breach and refuse to move. He ordered the retreat. The Ottoman army began withdrawing to their ships. They moved quickly, too quickly, abandoning heavy equipment, siege works, supplies. An army that had arrived as a conquering force was leaving as something that wanted to be elsewhere. La Valette watched them go from the walls. He did not order a pursuit. His men had nothing left for a pursuit. They had been fighting for 112 days on one meal a day with crumbling walls and dwindling ammunition. The men standing on those walls were not the same men who had watched the Ottoman fleet arrive in May. They were thinner, older, marked by 4 months of things that do not wash off, but they were standing. The relief force entered the fortifications on September 8th. The soldiers who arrived found something they had not expected. Not the desperate survivors of a losing siege. Not men broken by 4 months of impossible odds. Men who had held. The relief commander looked at the walls of Birgu, at the rubble and the patches and the improvised earthworks, and the places where stone had been replaced with barrels and timber and whatever else could be found. He looked at the defenders standing on those walls. He reportedly said nothing for a long time. Then he asked La Valette how they had done it. La Valette answered simply. They had not allowed themselves to consider the alternative. The Ottoman losses were catastrophic. Of the 40,000 men who had sailed from Constantinople in May, somewhere between 20 and 25,000 were dead, not wounded, dead, half the force, including the Janissaries, the elite soldiers who had never been broken before Malta, including Dragut, including the confidence that had carried the Ottoman Empire through a century of unbroken expansion in the Mediterranean. The Knights had lost approximately 3,000 of their 6,000 defenders, half their force. The island itself was devastated, Birgu and Senglea barely standing, Fort St. Elmo rubble, the countryside scorched and stripped by 4 months of an army living off it. Both sides had paid an extraordinary price, but only one side was still on the island. News of Malta's survival spread across Europe with a speed that felt almost physical. Within weeks, courts from London to Rome were celebrating. Queen Elizabeth I of England, Protestant, with no particular love for Catholic military orders, ordered Thanksgiving services in every church in the country. She understood what the fall of Malta would have meant. Sicily next, then Italy, then the rest. Voltaire would write about it a century later. Nothing is better known than the siege of Malta. He was not exaggerating. For the people of 1565, it was the event of the century, the moment the Ottoman advance into the Western Mediterranean stopped. La Valette spent the months after the siege doing what he had always done, planning, building. He had survived 4 months of the worst siege in the 16th century, and his first thought was that the Ottomans would come back. He needed Malta to be stronger when they did. He broke ground on a new city in March 1566, built on the peninsula of Mount Siberus, the same high ground the Ottomans had used to bombard Fort St. Elmo. He took that ground back permanently, built a fortified city on it that would make any future siege incomparably harder. He named it Valletta, after himself. It is still Malta's capital today. La Valette did not live long enough to see it finished. He died in 1568, 3 years after the siege, from a stroke suffered while riding. He was 73 years old. He had spent the last years of his life building the city that would carry his name into the future, a city whose walls were designed to make sure that what happened at Fort St. Elmo could never happen again. He was buried beneath the city he built, in a tomb that still exists. The inscription reads, "Here lies La Valette, worthy of eternal honor. He who was once the scourge of Africa and Asia, and the shield of Europe, whence he expelled the barbarians by his holy arms, is the first to be buried in this beloved city, of which he was also the founder, the shield of Europe." That is how history remembers him. The old man on the walls, the defender of civilization, the knight who held when everyone expected him to fall. What history remembers less readily is the harbor full of crosses, the heads loaded into cannons, the garrison of Fort St. Elmo sent to their deaths because La Valette needed the time their dying would buy, the 3,000 Muslim and Jewish slaves his ships had taken, the year he spent chained to an oar, and what that year produced in him, not mercy or understanding, but a cold, precise knowledge of exactly what he was willing to do. Both of those things were true simultaneously. That phrase has been sitting in this story since the beginning, because it is the only honest way to describe what happened at Malta. La Valette was extraordinary. He was also capable of things that the word extraordinary does not cover. The defense of Malta was genuinely one of the most remarkable military achievements of the 16th century. It was also achieved through methods that the civilization being defended was not supposed to practice. The question the Siege of Malta keeps asking, the one that has no clean answer, is whether the thing you are defending can survive what you do to defend it. La Valette would probably say yes. He built a city. It still stands. The Ottoman Empire never seriously threatened the Western Mediterranean again after 1565. 6 years later, the Christian fleet broke Ottoman naval power permanently at the Battle of Lepanto. The door that Malta held shut stayed shut, but the men who floated in the harbour on wooden crosses might answer differently. The siege ended on September 8, 1565. The Ottoman fleet sailed east. La Valette stood on the walls and watched them go. He had fired human heads from cannons at dawn. He had sent men to die in a fort he knew was lost. He had burned the bridge so his own soldiers could not retreat. He had done all of it, and he had held. Whether that makes him a hero depends entirely on what you think heroism requires, and what you think it can afford to cost. If this is your kind of history, the stories that don't resolve cleanly, leave a comment below. Did La Valette cross a line, or did the line not exist in that harbour in 1565? History has been arguing about it for 5 centuries. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this one.